I think we'll get started here. It's a little after 12:30. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Community Study Learning Collaborative. My name is Lisa Romley, and I am the Education Program Coordinator for the HEAL Study. Today, we're here to learn the tips and tricks of successful grant writing, and we are so fortunate to have 3 experienced grant writers with us here today. I just need to review a few housekeeping announcements before we get started. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded. And if your screen name is not your full name, you're using a partial name or you're using your phone, if you could please update that now and change it to your full name. This just helps when we compare the participants' names list with the registration list. We are offering CE credits for today's session. 1 CE credit has been approved for physicians, pharmacists, nurses, social workers, and licensed alcohol and drug counselors. And I'll give you instructions on how to obtain that CE credit at the end of the session. We also are offering certificate of attendance for anyone that may need that. We do ask that you stay on mute during this session. That just helps reduce the echo and extraneous noises. And if you have questions today, and we do welcome your questions, we hope this is a very interactive participation, that please use the raise hand feature. So you can click on the reaction button and then click on the raised hand, or you can just type your question in the chat box and we'll read it sometime during the session. Just to report that all presenters for today's session have stated that they do not have any relevant financial relationships to disclose. And the practice gap that we have identified is grant funding opportunities are routinely made available, but community members working within the recovery service sector often lack the knowledge and skills in writing a competitive grant application and locating funding opportunities. The educational need that'll be addressed is community members working within the recovery services are in need of funding to help start their program and help keep their program running efficiently. So developing the skill for writing a competitive grant and receiving funding would benefit the program and also the community at large. Today's learning objectives is employing strategies for locating appropriate funding opportunities, identifying common components of a competitive grant application, and developing effective writing strategies for a concise, clear grant application. And then we hope at the end of today's session, you'll have those skills, learn those type of skills for writing a competitive grant application and also identifying some major funding sources. So for today's session, we have Dr. Hilary Surratt moderating the session. Dr. Surratt is Associate Professor in the Center for Health Service Research and the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Kentucky. She is also a faculty member on the Healing Community team. She also has served as a principal investigator and co-investigator of more than 12 NIH funded studies. So I will now turn it over to Hilary to do the introduction of our speakers.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm very, very happy to be here. So I'm really excited to moderate this special HCS Learning Collaborative focusing on grant writing today. And I would echo Lisa, we are really fortunate to have 3 expert speakers with us today. And we're grateful to each of them for agreeing to be here, give their time to us, and share their wisdom on competitive grant writing. Just to echo Lisa, once again, please make this interactive. We want your questions in chat or raise your hand. So I know we're all anxious to hear from our presenters. So without further ado, I would like to give a brief introduction of each of them before we begin. So first, let me start with Ronne Nunley. She is Chief Business Development Officer for Pathways Incorporated. Ronne has served as Director of the Pathways Regional Prevention Center, the prevention arm of Pathways in Ashland for more than 17 years. Pathways Regional Prevention Center serves a 10-county region in northeastern Kentucky of alcohol, tobacco, and other drug prevention services. Ronne also served as manager for the statewide prevention enhancement site for environmental tobacco strategies for over 10 years. She has been the recipient of numerous awards, too numerous to sort of mention here, but notably in 2014, the Carter County Drug-Free Coalition Community Change Agent Award was given to Ronnie for her work organizing and securing funding for the community and the coalition. She has a wealth of experience with grant writing for various funders. And Ronnie, we really welcome you to the panel today. Anxious to hear your presentation. Before Ronnie kicks us off, however, I want to introduce the rest of the speakers. So we are also joined by Connie Neal. Connie is the Assistant Director of Chrysalis House since she retired from the Commonwealth of Kentucky Judicial Branch in 2015. Connie has more than 35 years experience in the field of social work. She began her career in the executive branch, working first in a residential group home for court-committed juvenile females, and then later as a unit social worker at Eastern State Hospital. Connie later joined the judicial branch, working for the Administrative Office of the Courts. And this is really exciting for me. She was on the team implementing the first AOC drug court program in Kentucky in Lexington. Connie has written grants and assisted with implementing drug, mental health, DUI, and veterans treatment courts throughout Kentucky. As the Assistant Director of Chrysalis House, Connie is responsible for writing and administering federal, state, local, and foundation grants that support the overall mission of Chrysalis House. So Connie, thank you so much to you for being with us today. We look forward to hearing from you in just a bit. And finally, I want to welcome David Gross as a speaker today. We are very fortunate to have David with us. David has been the director of the Northeast Kentucky Area Health Education Center, lovingly known as Northeast Kentucky AHEC, since December 2011. His broader role within the Northeast Kentucky AHEC host institution, which is St. Clair Healthcare in Moorhead, is as Administrative Director for Education and Research, which also includes overseeing graduate medical education programs and managing sponsored grant and research activities. Under David's leadership, the Northeast Kentucky AHEC has developed multiple health career pipeline programs, which have been nationally recognized. Importantly, the Northeast Kentucky AHEC spearheaded the development of the Northeast Kentucky Substance Use Response Coalition, which was selected as the National Rural Health Association's Outstanding Rural Health Program for 2021. David has served as project director and administrator of 8 federally funded grants focusing on addressing Northeastern Kentucky's opioid crisis. David is currently a member of the National AHEC organization's board of directors. He brings a wealth of experience in grant writing to the table today. So we welcome you, David, and look forward to hearing from you. So without further ado, I am going to quit talking so that we can hear from our first speaker. Ronnie, the floor is yours, and thank you once again for being with us today.
Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I work with Pathways, which is a community mental health center serving 10 counties in Northeast Kentucky. And each year we serve about 13,000 unduplicated community members, and we provide comprehensive mental health, intellectual and developmental disabilities and support services, as well as a continuum of substance abuse disorder services. These are some of the grants that we were awarded just in the past year. And you will notice the fluctuation from a $2,000 foundation grant to the SAMHSA grant for $3.56 million. And it's kind of interesting because some would wonder why you would bother with a $2,000 foundation grant. And yet, we utilize that grant to provide items for our crisis and residential recovery unit that typically can't be funded by other grants. I will also tell you that that little grant is just about as much work as some of the state grants. However, it is important to when you identify a need and you can connect that with a funder to make that connection. And we've actually had that foundation contact us back and ask if we want more money. So, which we never say no to. But these are just a few of the grants that were funded in this past year. So having written grants for many, many years and worked with many community partners who come and ask for help with writing grants, I think it's important to understand what they can and cannot do, because typically folks come with needs and want us to look for money or help them look for money. And I think it's important to point out that grant money is really about helping an organization achieve specific goals, and funders are typically looking for outcomes. That is what they fund, and it is really important to keep that in mind and to understand that grant funding should be used to complement what you're already doing, or used for seed money to launch new programs and services. And I say it's the icing on the cake, but it's not the cake. It's just to kind of keep that in mind. I will also interject here that we had a state agency that approached us a number of years ago and wanted us to apply for some funding. And my famous question is, what is the intended outcome? My staff threatened to have t-shirts made with that question, because that's what I always ask. And when they articulated their anticipated outcome, I had to regretfully inform them that they weren't putting enough resources to get that outcome. And something had to change. Either they had to change the anticipated outcome or the amount of funding. And I just say that so that folks can understand about being very realistic about the outcomes you can get. Fortunately, the state agency decided that they would fund short-term outcomes as opposed to long-term outcomes, and we thought we could get to those. So it's important to point out that grant funding is an incredible source of strategic funding, but you cannot or should not rely on that to get your organization out of the red. And grants are typically not used for day-to-day operation ongoing programs. So again, sometimes folks mistakenly think that if they have a program that is losing funding, that, well, let's just look for some grant money. And typically, that is not what we want to look for grant funding for. So here are some of my tips. Create a diversified fundraising plan and identify your priority funding needs and have those on hand so that when opportunities present, you can match those opportunities with your identified needs. And as a general rule, funding shouldn't be any more than your 20% of your revenue cycle. So it's important, again, in understanding what grants can and cannot do. Wow, there we go. And grant writing is a team sport. You must have an internal grant team. Minimally, I think it should include your CEO, your CFO, and a program director or program staff, and even program participants if that is feasible. I love this motto, don't do something about me without me. So I will tell you some grant failures. I assisted with a grant for youth. It was a beautifully written grant. It was funded. The program was a disaster, and it was a disaster because we never asked one young person if it was appealing or if they would want to participate. Another time, county called me to help them with a state grant. I met with them. I had written that particular grant for 2 other counties successfully. Went back, wrote the grant the day before submission. I sent it out to everybody, got no feedback, submitted it. It was funded. And when I went out to meet with the group to say, yay, we're funded, now we get to implement, they read the grant and said, we can't do this. And I'm like, okay, that's a problem. So I strongly encourage that internal grant team that can work together and make sure that you're on track with what you're asking for, the expectations. And again, don't do something about me without me. Also, very important to get that external team in place before you write the grant. Most grants now are going away from letters of support and asking for letters of commitment. So they really want to know what those community partners are going to do. How are they going to participate? What are they going to contribute? And so it's really important in securing those partners that you have a relationship. So I don't mind asking community partners, can we meet in your building? Can your staff serve on an advisory board? Making that a very important commitment, since letters of support are no longer accepted in most grants. And here's another thing. I keep a folder of all frequently required documents and keep it updated. This will save a lot of time when you're applying. Things like your IRS C3 tax document, a current audit, I have a cheat sheet, I call it, of federally assigned numbers. Includes the state EMARS number, but other things like a current list of your board of directors, an organizational chart. So these are things that typically are asked for in grants, and having those things on hand it just makes that process go much more smoothly. Accreditations often asked for, like CARF or JCO. Those things are really important too. And here's something else, sustainability. Every grant asks about how are you going to sustain that? Now, going back to understanding that grant money is seed money, funders want to know that at least part of your effort will be ongoing after you're awarded the grant. So it should not be an afterthought. And I always encourage folks to ask the question, what do we want to sustain? Knowing that if the funding source is gone, most likely you can't sustain all of your efforts. So what is important? What is critical to the outcomes? And thinking about people, programs, processes, and even infrastructure. So if you can say to a funder after this funding is gone, we will have this infrastructure in place. We will have this policy in place. We will have these procedures in place that will help with your sustainability. You can think fee for service, fundraising campaigns, memberships, even product development that may come out of your efforts. But understanding sustainability planning is ongoing. I also always like to involve our community partners in sustainability because they've written letters of commitment and have committed certain things to the grant. That can also be a part of your sustainability as well. And just a few more things, connecting the dots, which is so important, especially if you have a grant writing team, making sure that what you're putting in your needs assessment is connected to your goals and objectives, and your strategies, programs, and activities actually help you meet your goals and objectives, and that your budget reflects your goals and objectives. So I once wrote a grant and the funder was just adamant that the budget only, to be very careful about the budget matching up with goals and objectives. So for every budget item, I put a goal and objective by that budget item so they could clearly see that the budget was connected to the grant effort. And I guess it was a success because the next year they asked everybody to do that. But it was just really important for that particular funder to see that all the dots were connected. And then really important, especially if you're new to grant writing, is knowing the difference between process and outcome. They're both necessary, but understanding that outcomes are funded. And I always like to underpromise and overperform. It's much better than overpromising and underperforming. And that's kind of a fine line. But I always work with the program folks back to my grant team to get those numbers. So if we're going to project numbers of folks we're going to reach with a grant in a particular area, it's looking at that historic data. How many have we reached and how many more could we reach if we had this funding, but making sure that we are not overpromising and overinflating those numbers because there's nothing worse than having to report back to a grant that you are underperforming. And then knowing the difference between a goal and objective, and really I put this in here because the federal grants are now asking with objectives to include, i.e., inclusive and equitable as a part of that objective. And so I just wrote a grant where we included language to reflect that. So that's kind of important to understand that that's going to probably going forth, that will be a part of our grant writing experience. And then just as a rule of thumb, you should have 3 objectives for every goal. And if you don't, you may want to rethink that. And I'll just wrap up with saying that grant writing is really about reading, writing, and arithmetic. And when I say reading, when I get a grant application, I read it through again with a highlighter, and then I read it through again to make sure that I'm following all of the directions, particularly with federal grants. I will tell you, I had the privilege of going to Washington and serving on a review team. And the grants that we got were only the grants that had met all of the technical qualifications. The grants had not even been read yet, and yet they had gone through to make sure that all of those, the margins, the font size, and all of those things had been met before we even got to read the grants. So it is really important to read those instructions carefully and understand all of the guidelines, and then writing the grant, again, making sure that you're connecting all of the dots. And then my least favorite is the budget, but the arithmetic, and making sure that that matches, that you've captured all your in-kind contributions and all of that. So but it is really, I would say, the most important step is reading the grant application and understanding what's being required. And if you've looked at that new abatement application, you will understand why that is so critically important. And I've thrown in a resource here. It's from the Grantsmanship Center that has been very helpful, program planning and proposal writing. So it has some very helpful information. I will also tell you that SAMHSA puts out a guide that I find extremely helpful on how to format tables and how to maximize your space, and that's available on the SAMHSA website as well.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think you really covered the the waterfront, from the technical specifications all the way to sort of planning for sustainability with community partners. So I really, really appreciate you sharing all of that information with our attendees today. I do want to take a moment because we did have a question that came in through the chat. And I want to just pose it to you, Ronnie, knowing that, others may also want to respond, or we may, circle back to this in a Q&A session. But there was a question from a participant that mentions that their agency is new to grant writing, and also that they are a for-profit agency. And the question is really around, is it realistic for a for-profit agency to be able to obtain grant funding? Ronnie, I don't know if you're able to comment on that in your experience. Others are kind of responding in the chat as well, but do you have a perspective that you can offer on the sort of feasibility of a for-profit agency being able to obtain grant funding?
It is possible with some grants, and that's why it's important to read the application. I would also say that for-profits can partner with nonprofits, and the nonprofit be the lead organization. So, and I'll ask Connie and David for their input, but it's not exclusive. It doesn't exclude folks from applying, but a lot of the grants will tell you up front whether you can be for-profit or you must be a nonprofit to apply.
Thank you. That's great advice. David, I see you came off mute. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, the HRSA grants that our shop has primarily applied for, it does exclude for-profits. And even to Ronnie's point about a nonprofit taking the lead and collaborating with a for-profit, we can't even, for instance, on the grants that we've gotten, contract with a for-profit agency. It's just not allowed. So, but there are numerous foundation grants that certainly would be targeted toward for-profits.
Wonderful. So that's good advice. Sounds like it's very much dependent on the funder and the mechanism potentially. So hopefully that is helpful to you. Thank you for posing the question. I think we'll have time to ask Ronnie some follow-up in our sort of open Q&A at the end. So Ronnie, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom. We will circle back. I know there are numerous questions that people have in mind. And maybe at this time, we'll go ahead, if that's okay for you, Lisa, we'll go ahead and move to Connie as our second presenter. I know that she's ready to go. And so we'll hear from her about her experience with grant writing at this time.
Thank you, Hillary.
Of course. Welcome.
Let me get my screen share up here. Okay. I am Connie Neal. I'm the assistant director at Chrysalis House. Chrysalis House is a nonprofit. We are actually one of the oldest and largest treatment centers for women in the state of Kentucky. Next year, we will be 43 years old. So coming up on a 50-year anniversary in the next few years. Chrysalis House actually started as a halfway house for women in 1978 and has grown and expanded over the years to now include 3 residential facilities specializing in the treatment of pregnant and parenting women. We are one of the few facilities in the state that do allow women to have their children on site with them during their treatment episode. Children under the age of 3 can live full-time on site with mom. Children who are older can visit on weekends, summers, and during the holidays. We are a CARF accredited organization. We're certified to provide levels of care ASAM 3.5 and 3.1, and we're a long-term residential program. Our average length of stay is about 5 to 6 months. In addition to our residential facilities, we also have an outpatient program, which is utilized for step-down aftercare for our women, but we also do take referrals from probation, parole, drug court, any of the other outside agencies for women who are in need of outpatient treatment. And we also offer parenting classes through our outpatient program, and couples, partners, single dads can also participate in those parenting classes. In addition to residential and outpatient, we also have a sober living apartment complex. We have a 40-unit apartment complex on our campus where moms can transition after they complete residential treatment, and their entire families can come live with them. There are 40 units of 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. Any of their children can come. Any adults who come live there have to agree to be on the lease and have to agree to random drug and alcohol testing. And that apartment complex is NAR certified. So we're a NAR level 2 certified program. Chrysalis House really didn't start billing. We were kind of gearing up for it when I got here in 2015, but we didn't actually start billing Medicaid until 2018. So from early on until 2018, we were totally sustained by grant funds, whether those be the large government grants, federal, state, local, foundation grants, and then private donations as well. So Medicaid billing has allowed us to enhance some of our services and increase our staffing, but our grants really sustain the program because we are able to keep women long past what Medicaid will pay for in billable days. So whereas we may get 14 to 21 billable days for a pregnant woman, our grants will make up the remaining 5 to 6 months that she is in our treatment program. And we also use a lot of the smaller foundation grants to buy supplies for the babies and children. So we can supply mom with everything she needs to be able to take care of her child while she's here. I apologize that I'm not moving here.
Connie, just click on your screen and then hit the arrow down button.
Ah, there we go. Okay. I think Ronnie did such a great job of laying a foundation and kind of telling us, how to use grants and what grants are for, and really educating us on getting ready to do that. And my presentation, I think, is a little more focused on kind of just really getting in there and writing the grant. But you are going to hear just a little bit of duplication, I think, because all of us do a lot of the same things, I think. One of my biggest tip is to give yourself plenty of time to complete the application. Last minute applications can be very anxiety producing, and you don't have a lot of time to gather all of your information. I think Ronnie said she reads the notice of funding opportunity and she reads it again, and then she reads it again. And that's exactly what I do, and have that highlighter and highlight things that you feel like are important. Any questions or concerns that you have that you want to take to someone else to address. But you really can't be familiar enough with your notice of funding opportunity. I also will pull it up in an electronic form, and that way if I have a question and I need to go back to it, I can just do a quick word search instead of having to go through the entire document, and it can help me get to where I need to be so that I can answer my question pretty quickly. You want to make sure that your organization meets all criteria for eligibility. Some grants have specific scopes of things that they fund. Some have specific things that they want to target, like education or workforce development or children's services. And so you just want to make sure that you meet all those eligibility criteria, and that you're able to meet all of the requirements that are laid out in the grant. And most grant applications will have an identified contact person. And if you have any question whatsoever, if there's anything that you don't understand, you want to make sure that you reach out to those people so that you're very clear on what your expectations are with regard to submitting your application. Complete all necessary activities. This goes back to some of the things that Ronnie was saying. You want to make sure that you have your DUNS number, that you have your SAM registration. If you have to get anything from any government agency, that's going to be one of the first things that you're going to want to do. With the SAMHSA grants, sometimes you have to get certifications from Department of Behavioral Health or from your single state authority, and that can take some time to get. So you really want to look and see, and if that's one of your requirements, make sure that you are on that early, and make sure that you follow up with those contacts regularly until you get what you need. I also try to gather all of my attachments before I start writing, and that could be your 501c3 letter, any financial statements that they're looking for. If you're asking to pay for staff salaries, oftentimes they're going to want their resumes and their job descriptions, and oftentimes those are page limited, so you may have to do some editing and cut some things down. And so you want to make sure that you keep it within their parameters and that you have all of those things ready to go once you get your grant ready to submit. Right before I start doing my research, I will develop an outline, and I'll just go through the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, look at their instructions, and I will copy and paste everything from the NOFO into a Word document, and that becomes my living working document. And so I will include things like character limits or word limits, the very specific information that they are requesting in there, so that I don't have to continuously refer back to my NOFO. Everything that I need to be able to write my grant is right there in my outline. Research, that's the next most important thing, and what you want to do is really thoroughly review each section of your outline and understand all of the topics and questions that they want covered. What I do is I will create a parking lot page, and that's where I just go and online and I start doing my research, and I just start looking at those topics and questions, and I plug in those topics and then I research. One of the things that you really don't want to do is over research, because you can find yourself in rabbit holes if you do that. And I have a tendency to do that. If something is interesting to me, then I'll keep clicking on links and clicking on links. And eventually I find that I'm off of my topic. It might be interesting to me, but it's not really related to the grant that I'm writing. And so you want to do some very thorough research, but don't over research, but also don't settle for easily accessible data. Oftentimes you can go just a little bit deeper and find something that's a little more applicable to your topic. My parking lot page is where I copy and paste quotes that I may want to use, demographic data that I want. And one of the things that you make sure that you do when you create your parking lot page is to add the citations. There's been a few times where I've gotten all caught up in the information, and I'm reading something, I'm really excited about what I'm reading, and I'm copying and pasting it, and then I go to write my grant and I realize that I forgot to put the citation down. And so make sure that you get your citation on there when you're doing your research, so that you have that ready. And you also want to make sure that your data is current and relevant. You don't want to write a grant in 2022 and reference information from 2006. You really want to make sure, because research is ever evolving, there are emergent trends. It may be data that is more current, but also when you're collecting data, oftentimes the most current data can be 3 to 4 to 5 years behind, depending on how often they collect those and how often things are published. And so if I do have to use an old citation, I'll often note in that citation that this was the latest available data, or the latest available data that I could find, so that the funders know that I've searched and I've looked. I just haven't been able to find anything that's more recent than what I'm giving them. Know your audience. When you're doing your research, look at who your funder is and know who they are. Some of these grants are going to be very technical. They're going to want very technical language. They are going to want scientific data, and they're going to want citations that can back that up. Particularly if you're talking about government grants. But if you're talking about foundation grants, sometimes those are technical, but a lot of the times those are more touchy-feely. They want to hear your story. They want to hear successes in your population. They want to hear struggles that your patients or clients have overcome. And so make sure that you know what kind of language your audience is looking for, so that you can tailor your writing style of what they want. When I was with drug courts, all my grants were very technical. When I came came to Chrysalis House with the foundation grants, I would make them very technical originally, and I would always ask people to read them, and they would bring them back to me and say, you got to add more flower in here. You got to add more fluff in here, make it a little more emotional. And so it took me a little while to to make that transition from very technical grant writing to flowery storytelling grant writing. And so you really have to know what your funders are looking for, the people who are reading and reviewing your grants. Look for other projects that your funder has funded. Sometimes in their portals or on their websites, they will post projects that they funded. And so you can kind of see if your priority areas or your intended outcomes for the grant match up with what their priority areas and intended outcomes are. Also, too, when you're looking at your data, always try to include your agency specific data as well as local, statewide, or national data, because they a lot of times funders really want to know we see what your demographics look like in your area, but do those demographics in your area match the demographics that you're serving in your program? And so they want to know not only who lives where you are working and where the funds are going to go, but who are the people that are actually going to benefit from those funds? What are you going to do to help them and who they are? Going back to something Ronnie said, she said build a grant writing team, and I totally agree with that. Consult with your colleagues, your peers, other team members and stakeholders, community partners. You want to see what they can contribute, how they can help. Partnering with them. If you can't provide some of the services or if you can't meet some of the requirements, are there agencies that you work with regularly? And you could either partner with them in the grant writing, or you could do an MOU or an MOA with them so that you can bring them in to provide some of those services that you can't provide. And one of the other things that you can do with some agencies, SAMHSA, BJA, some of the bigger agencies for sure, is you can request feedback from previous grants. So if you wrote a grant that either wasn't funded or was funded, you can request the reviewer's comments and you can look at that, and it can tell you where you were missing information, where you didn't address specifically some of the points that they were asking for. And that can really help you the next time you write a grant for that organization or write a similar grant to plug those things in that you missed the first time. And in your writing process, one of the things you want to make sure is do not deviate from the format that is given to you. Sometimes if you have page limits and you look at, okay, if I could just move this section up here and this section down here, then that could give me like 5 lines. And sometimes it may be tempting to do that, but you really need to follow your format very carefully. Make sure that you don't deviate from that. One of the things also that you want to look at is how do they want their sections headed? Do they want you to like type out in the body of your grant the title of the section, or are they okay with just, section 1B? And so some of them want that narrative. Others are okay if you just use numbers and letters, and that can save you some space. And so if you need some extra lines or some extra characters, and you're putting all that narrative in there and they're not requesting it, then you're selling yourself short and you're robbing yourself of the ability to include some things that you might want to include. I mentioned this before, but make sure that your language is appropriate for the funder. Also steer clear of acronyms unless you make sure that you have identified what that acronym is. And if you're writing a particularly long grant, I would identify that acronym more than one time so that the funder doesn't have to flip back to page 2 and say, oh, what did NOFO stand for? I'm on page 31 now and I can't remember that. And so if you're going to have a longer grant, identify those acronyms more than one time. Be thoughtful and deliberate with your statement of need. That's often the very first part of your grant. And that is the section where you really do want to follow their instructions and give them every piece of information that they're asking for. You really, and sometimes even if you're writing a technical grant, sometimes your statement of need can be a little less technical if you're identifying the population and really talking about their needs. We work with pregnant and parenting women, and babies. And so a lot of the times, I'll throw that baby language in there, and moms with their children, and bonding during treatment, and really kind of get that out there so they get the feeling that, not only are we targeting the needs of the women here, but there are also children involved. And sometimes that can tug at heartstrings. So I think that's sometimes a little advantage that we have here when we're writing our grants. And it's okay to reflect back or refer back to specific language from the funding opportunity notification. The purpose of this grant is, and just copy what the funding opportunity page said. And so you're really saying, okay, I understand the purpose of this, and everything that I'm doing in this grant is going to tie back to the reason you are issuing this funding opportunity. And so it's okay to go into your NOFO and pull out some of that language and use it throughout your grant periodically. Be concise but thorough. Again, most grants don't just allow you to go on and on and on until you've told your story. There are character limits, word limits, font sizes, page limits. Is it single spaced or double spaced? I had a terrifying experience years ago where when SAMHSA first changed some of their formats and we were used to writing 40-page grants single spaced, I got a NOFO, and it was double spaced. It was a 40-page grant, but it was double spaced. I didn't pay enough attention to that, and I wrote a single spaced grant. And so a couple days before time to submit, and I asked someone to read it, and got a call back that said, this is supposed to be double spaced. And so I had to literally cut out half of my grant in 2 days, but keep my content the same. And so pay attention to that, and be concise. But in being concise, also be very thorough in answering your questions to the best of your ability. And don't include information, facts, or data not asked for. Oftentimes there's just not enough room for that. You want to stick with the outline. You want to stick with the format. You want to make sure that you're giving them what they want. We talked about word character limits. Recycle content thoughtfully. There are, particularly if you're like me and you're writing grants for the same organization all of the time, there's a lot of information that you use in one grant that you're able to recycle and use in other grants as well. But when you do that, you want to make sure that if there are any tweaks that you need to make to that you make those, and that if there's any data that you need to update, that you update that data. There may be a new citation that you want to add in there. So I think it's okay to recycle your content and to include it in more than one grant. Just make sure that you update that. But be very careful if you're doing that with the same funder year after year. You don't want to submit the same grant with just updated data. You can use some of that content, but you also need to make it original every time, because I don't know this for sure, but I think they probably go back. I often wonder when I write my 2021 NAS grant, do they go back and look at my 2020 NAS grant and say, okay, how much of this did she just lift from that other grant and drop in here? And so I always try to add something original, something new, a new evidence-based practice, new emerging trends, just something that I can add that makes this grant original and helps it stand out from the grant that I wrote before. Develop realistic goals, objectives, and outcome. I totally agree with Ronnie. Do not overproject. You might want to say, oh, I think 90% of our patients are going to blah, 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 when the reality is it's probably closer to 40%. And I think that the funders appreciate, I think it's instinctual to say, oh, the more I say we're going to do, the more chances that we are of getting funded, but you also have to realize that they are funding outcomes. And if you overproject and you're not able to meet those outcomes, then that really does decrease your ability to get funding, and it also doesn't help for future grants either. Ask others to review sections as you complete them, and then to review your entire grant. And for me, that is so important, because once I do the research and then I write it and then I read it and then I read it again and then I try to cut down sentences or words and I read it again, it gets to a point to where I feel like I've kind of memorized it. And I don't think that I'm picking up on my own errors. I'm not seeing typos because I'm just going through it so fast because I know what it's going to say. So for me, it's really important as I'm writing ongoing to have other people review it for me, edit it for me. Is what I'm saying makes sense? Do I need to phrase this in a different way? Can you help me come up with a way to say this in 5 words instead of 15 words? And so that's so important to not only collaborate on the front end with what you're going to do, but also to get that input on the back end to make sure that you have the best application possible. And a lot of the federal grants require an evaluator or an evaluation. That to me is probably one of the most complicated parts of the grant, and I can't imagine having to do that myself. And so I strongly encourage working with an experienced evaluator. We work with both the University of Kentucky Center on Drug and Alcohol Research and Morehead State University. We've got several federal grants and we use both of them to do our evaluations. And so regardless of where you are in the state, if there's a university near you, they have a research department, they have a social services department, they have people who are interested in doing that. If you don't already have those contacts, I encourage you to reach out and develop those relationships, because that really enhances your grant application if you have a really strong evaluation component to that. And just a couple of other things to consider, considering partnering with other partners, agencies, if you don't feel like you can meet all of the criteria, developing those relationships and keeping those ongoing can really enhance your opportunities. Ronnie, I think, said this earlier, create folders for commonly required attachments, your 50C3 letters, your MOUs, and also keep your MOUs or MOAs updated. If you have a time frame on them, then you want to make sure that you note that so that you can keep those updated. That way, when you're writing your grant, you don't have to reach out to all of those agencies again. You can use those MOUs that you already have as long as they're updated. So I do my folder of my MOUs, and I have notifications that come up that tell me, okay, it's time to update this one, it's time to update that one, and get those done before you even start writing your grant. And that way you don't have to spend time doing that. Building ongoing relationships with funders, and that's extremely important, particularly if you're doing those foundation grants. We've met a lot of those people through networking or at other events. And our community relations director happened to be in an event, and she was sitting with someone from Valvoline, and she told this person about Chrysalis House, and he said, our grant portal is open, we're accepting applications, submit the grant. And so she told me the next day, I did the grant, and 2 weeks later we had $1,500. And so get the word out there, network, and build those relationships. And the last thing I'll say, save your parking lots. Yeah, so your citations, because again, you can recycle those and use those for other grants. But the last thing is don't give up. Just keep going and ask for help, ask for advice, and contact those funders and ask your questions, and just keep writing. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was an amazing I loved hearing about just the services at Chrysalis House and how you're really serving parenting women and children and families. I think that was marvelous to hear more about that work. And of course, your tips for successful grant writing. I think I heard some really nice kind of overlap with Ronnie in some ways, right? Like you guys are honing in on some very key activities that are involved, but also really unique things that you're doing. And I loved what you said about really knowing the funder, right? And just the difference between really technical heavy grants and more foundation oriented grants. So Thank you so much for really sharing all of that and sharing your process that you go through with writing. I think that's really important for our attendees to hear as well. Before we move to David, there are some questions that came through the chat that I wanted to just take a moment and direct to you, Connie, and Ronnie and David as well. Please feel free to weigh in with your experience. We had an attendee who asked, in each of your organizations, who is responsible for grant writing? Do any of your organizations, I'm sorry, I lost it there. Do any of your organizations have a specific grant writer, or is it part of another person's, another position's job description? So we also had some folks weighing in from the chat, but they wanted the presenters to sort of comment on this. Connie, could you start us off with a comment?
Sure. For Chrysalis House, I am the grant writer. That was actually why when I was hired as the assistant director, that was to be the largest part of my job. Before I came here, they were paying outside grant writers to do their grant writing. And so in this position, it all comes to me. But when you ask, is it part of another job description, since I've been here and was hired as the grant writer, now I'm also doing HR and training and 100 other things. And so it's kind of both. So that started as my primary function, but it certainly isn't all that I do here.
Terrific. Thank you. Ronnie, did you want to sort of weigh in on your perspective?
So yes, for years I was the grant writer, and then we contracted with someone outside the agency for 2 years. That didn't work too well, and it wasn't the grant writer, it was the communication and access to folks inside the agency, I think, that became a barrier. And so that contract expired, and then it came back to me. And as with Connie, I do a gazillion other things. So we just recently hired a grant writer, grant manager, who will be assuming a lot of these duties, and I'm slowly kind of bringing her along and introducing her to all the systems and getting her in contact with some of the foundations that we have grants with. So we're have an internal grant writer now, and maybe next year I'll let you know how that goes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Ronnie. And thank you for the questions. Keep them coming in chat. And thank you to our panelists for the really thoughtful responses. I think in the interest of time, David, I'd like to turn the floor over to you so that we have time for your presentation. And of course, we'll have a few minutes at the end for any additional questions that come in. So David, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did not unmute. Now, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure also that everyone saw the comment that I made in the chat. So I misspoke earlier. When you're like me and Ronnie and Connie and doing multiple grant applications for multiple agencies, we've done HRSA, FCC, USDA. I misspoke. It was actually the USDA grants that specifically do not allow for-profits. We recently got one of those, and we could not even subcontract with a for-profit agency. But the HRSA grants, that at least the ones that we pursued, do allow for-profit. So I wanted to make sure that everybody noticed that. So just to start with, Hillary mentioned at the beginning that part of my job within St. Clair Healthcare is directing the Northeast Kentucky AHEC, Area Health Education Center. Hopefully, all of you have had some occasion to interact with the AHEC in your particular region, but just in case you've not, it's a national program. I think at this point, 48 states have an AHEC presence within them. In Kentucky, there are 8 regional centers. You see them here on the screen. In Kentucky, it's a little bit different than some other states. In Louisiana, for instance, the AHECs can be their own 501c3 independent organization. In Kentucky, the regional AHECs are hosted. So we are all departments of the organization that hosts us. In my case, we're hosted by St. Clair Healthcare, a hospital based in Moorhead. The hospital itself serves 11 counties, but my regional AHEC serves 17 counties. So my AHEC actually has a larger service region than the hospital. And the AHEC department, it is entirely grant and contract funded, whereas the hospital, of course, is based on clinical revenue. My department is entirely grant and contract funded. So that's what has motivated a lot of our grant writing over the last few years. We've taken some funding cuts from our traditional state and federal funding that we've gotten over the years, and that motivated us to start pursuing some of the federal grants. But you see at the bottom the four main strategies that AHECs have. So the grant writing aspect that I'm going to be talking with you about here is primarily related to that community health function. And I hope that I can be a little bit motivational for the audience. That I think from the chat I've picked up that there are several folks on here that are new to grant writing. And at one point, all of us were new to grant writing. And that was certainly true for us up until about 5.5 years ago. So I want to emphasize to you that you literally can start from nothing, because that's where my group started. AHEC, again, we've gotten state and federal funding streams that basically just came to us. We didn't have to apply for anything. But once those started being cut, we realized we've got to do something to generate some additional revenue. And for us, it started with one event, and I'm not making this up. One event is what got us started. So we were invited or asked to facilitate continuing education credits for an event in Mason County in Maysville. They realized the opioid crisis was having a major impact in their county. Wanted to have an event for different types of providers, reached out to us as their regional continuing education credit provider. We went. It was an amazing event. You see strong attendance. I'll emphasize, this was on a snowy night in January. Had 72 attendees, good diversity of providers, and the feedback and the dialogue and engagement was just phenomenal. And I left there thinking, gosh, we've done a really good thing here now. Look at the event we had and how phenomenal it was. And came back the next day, and we had already started getting Facebook posts, and I got a couple of emails and a couple of phone calls. David, this event you all had last night in Maysville, we're hearing about it, and it was great. Could you try to do this in other places across the region? And so again, when I drove home that night, I had no idea that my work life was going to change forever, because that one activity literally led to what has become a succession of federal grants at this point. Just a few weeks after we had that first event in Maysville, we've been so fortuitous in so many occasions throughout our grant projects here, is that a grant to convey MAT, which is medication assisted treatment information across a rural region, it came out from HRSA literally just weeks after this. So just what we had done and had gotten rave reviews about, a funding opportunity became available to do more of that. So we took a chance, applied for that one, went really well. And HRSA actually reached out toward the end of year one of that project and said, would you consider doing this again if we gave you a little bit more money? So that doesn't happen very often, that HRSA initiates, would you do more of this? If we pay you, you've generally got to apply. But I will emphasize that, so this is across a 5-year period, generated a little over $5 million. And again, if you're on here and you've never applied for a grant before, you can do this too, because we were in that exact same situation. I had never written a grant myself before we started down this path. So I do have a writing background, so I will mention that, but you can start literally from scratch. I will say we started with 1-year planning grants, as you kind of see mentioned or see listed on the screen here, but we've built up to 3 and 5-year projects. There's one on here that's outside of our opioid projects. I've got a 5-year grant that is under review right now that we're hearing really good things about. So I think that's going to get funded. But I will also mention that we are not doing this alone. I think the speakers have mentioned to collaborate. So we, as St. Clair, have applied for these grants on behalf of the Northeast Kentucky Substance Use Response Coalition, 8 organizations across our region, including Pathways that Ronnie's located within. St. Clair, my department, applies for these grants on behalf of the coalition, and we've done some really interesting and impactful things with this grant funding. So I don't think that it's been mentioned yet, kind of where to look, and that's kind of the first step in the process. Really, it's like if you've never done a grant before, or if you looked a little bit but you don't know where else to look, I would emphasize starting with grants.gov. You can find literally any federal grant that's available is going to be listed on there. One thing that's helpful, you can search by government department, by the name of the grant, different ways to search there. They do have a forecast where even if the grant is not currently available, it will tell you generally the next time that it will be available, just so you can kind of plan out internally when you might be thinking about applying for that. And then the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy, all of our grants, since we're located in a rural area, have been rural focused. So the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy, you can sign up for their weekly e-blast through the grants.gov page, and they'll send out an email every Friday, typically, that lists lots of content and information, but also a listing of upcoming grants that might be interesting to you. My go-to location, and I was telling my colleagues I'm a little bit apprehensive to share too much information because you all could become future competitors. But in the interest of collaboration and being a good team player, wanting to do what's in the best interest of Kentucky, I'll share with you my go-to place when I'm looking for grants is the Rural Health Information Hub. All kinds of rural health information there. And once you find a grant, they have lots of statistics and data and charts that you can include in your application. But they have a funding opportunities tab where you can search in a variety of ways. First, what's new. So within the past 30 days, all the funding opportunities available within the last month, essentially. And then you can also search by type, by sponsor, by topic, and by state. So it's really helpful and really allows you to in a bite-sized portion, kind of search for different kinds of funding opportunities. I saw that Matt Coleman was on the webinar here, so I didn't know you were going to be doing that, Matt. So, but I'm giving you all a plug. The Kentucky Office of Rural Health also has a weekly blast. Theirs comes out on Monday. So if you missed it in the FORP blast, the Kentucky Office of Rural Health generally has a listing also of grants that might be of interest to Kentucky organizations. I will say this is looking for the funding opportunities. That's the easy part. There is a multitude, and it seems like since the pandemic that it's even gotten more so. There are so many funding opportunities available at this point. What's going to be harder for you is determining which one of these or ones of these that you and your organization think that you could be competitive for and are willing to invest the time and effort to apply for. I will say grant writing is a hard way to make a living because it is so challenging. You've heard just the minutia of detail and just putting the application together. It is not easy. I want to emphasize that to you up front. But for instance, the one that I'm working on now, I've spent the entire morning working on the grant application. There are 44 awards given out nationally. So you kind of look at that and think, less than one per state. How competitive could we be? The technical assistance call for this one, when they had it a few weeks ago, there were over 300 individuals on it. So you kind of know from that this is going to be really competitive. But we've had a lot of success applying for grants through this division within HRSA. So even though it's less than one per state, we feel pretty confident that we can get this. And I'll say within my shop, if we don't think we can score at least a 95 on an application, we don't apply, because we are a small group that's working on this. And in addition to writing the grants, this might be a little bit different than Ronnie and Connie. Our department also runs the grants. We are the project staff. We're the project director, the coordinators, all that sort of thing. So we're doing the writing and the managing of the projects at the same time. So you've got to analyze your unique organizational situation and just make sure, are we willing to invest the time and effort to put together a strong application? Because it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. Second, this has been mentioned by both of the previous speakers, read the NOFO. And I think Connie even said, read it again and again. I've got mine. It has become really ragged at this point. I had to restaple it this morning. It came apart, and lots of highlights and red marks and everything through here. But typically any funding opportunity, at least through HRSA, and I'm sure most of the other federal ones, have a technical assistance call really early on in the application window, where you can log in. And like I mentioned earlier, you can see how many other people are joining that, just to get a feel for how much competition there's going to be. They'll go through the NOFO step by step, basically give you an overview. Even at our point where we've gotten several of these, I would never say, we know this HRSA application process, we're not going to do that. We always join the TA call just in case there's some new nugget that could be important for the application process. You see at the bottom of this page that I've included on the screen here, it has the director for this particular funding opportunity. Don't hesitate to reach out to those folks. That is what they're there for. So I will say, don't expect a quick response. So that's as Connie had mentioned, get started early in the process and make sure that you allow yourself enough time. But don't hesitate to reach out to the project officer, but they're generally not overly speedy in responding. And I will say, I'm a perfectionist of OCD. That's part of why I think that we've been pretty good with grants, is that details matter. And I'm a former newspaper editor early in my career. So that's just kind of getting used to editing and re-editing and making sure that everything flows correctly. All that sort of thing has been helpful for us, but the details matter. In the applications, it always tells what's the page limit maximum. As Connie had mentioned, it gives you the exact order that they want things in. They are giving you, here are the instructions, the rules to play by, and it is not to your benefit to freelance. You want to follow the rules the way that they've laid them out. I will say that we were written in to an application that a large organization in this state did 3-4 years ago at this point. They submitted the application and they exceeded the page limit, and it was just thrown back to them. So, I mean, it's to have invested that much time and effort and to have missed that what the guidance said, this page counts, these don't, that they exceeded the page count and their application was thrown out. So they had invested all that time and effort for nothing. And small organizations, like I'm sure many of those on the call here, we can't afford to do that. So we've got to follow the rules. And then for the HRSA applications, at least that we've done, at the back of the application, the back of the NOFO, it gives you the review criteria. It tells you exactly what the reviewers are going to be scoring on. And I mean, I'll read the entire NOFO multiple times, but I'll always go back to that one toward the end of the application process just to make sure, did we hit on this? Did we hit on that? I mean, the HRSA ones, at least, I generally don't think that they're scoring, well, your needs assessment section was fabulous, we're giving you X number of points. They are almost more looking for points to deduct. I mean, when we get the score sheets at the end of it, they aren't overly praiseworthy in terms of like what was good in the application. It's showing you like what they deemed you for. So I think those reviewers are just going through, well, they didn't do this, and they're just deducting points. So make sure that you check those review criteria and score your own submission against that. I'll also say, you see the one on the screen, this is the next one I'm going to be starting on. And it might be of interest to some of you on this call, because this is within your topic area. I really think that some of these federal agencies intentionally have some of these applications due around holidays. The one that I'm working on now is due the week of Thanksgiving. So I think they're trying to limit the number of applications that they get. This new one that's on the screen, it came out in late October and is due in mid-January. So you've got Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, all in between there. I think that they're trying to weed out folks that are faint of heart, that aren't willing to invest the time and effort over the holiday season to put in an application. So if you are, this could be one of those where it might conceivably not be quite as competitive as some of the other federal grant applications. And then just some other general stuff. Again, grant writing is not a solo activity. I can't imagine undertaking an 80-page application by myself. It is a team sport, as Ronnie said. And I would encourage you, if you have the financial ability to use a grant writer. We do, even though I've got a writing background. One of my grant team members is phenomenal with the budgeting and all the logistics of the applications. It's daunting to me to think, for the narrative part, for instance, ours is typically, for an 80-page application, the narrative is usually 35 pages or so. To start with a blank screen and start writing, I'm not up for that. So we usually do all the attachments ourselves, and then hire a grant writer to do most of the narrative, and then I'll edit and re-edit generally the narrative, just because even though the grant writer's doing it, it's me and my shop that we need the funding. So I'm going to invest all the time and effort I can to give us the best shot. But if you have the ability to use a grant writer, I would encourage that. The one that we use, I was floored at how reasonable the price was. So if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not sure we can afford this, I think you could probably find one that that would be within your financial capabilities. Again, you've heard, allow yourself plenty of time. I always also say submit a little bit early. It would be miserable to me to think about being here on the day the grant is due, and it's due at 11:59 p.m. and it's 8 o'clock, and you're still having submission issues, because anything can happen. The power can blink, your Wi-Fi can go out, whatever the case may be. So we always intentionally submit 3 to 4 days early, at least. The HRSA grants, at least, they ask for sometimes both, a letter of commitment, which is the organizations that you're really going to partner with on the project, that you're going to be sharing some of the funding with. They also ask for letters of support from non-coalition or network, for instance, community partners. But even though it says letters of support, what we've heard from some of the HRSA folks is that they don't want just a letter that's saying, we have worked with this organization in the past and we support what they're doing. They are really looking, even as for a letter of support, they're looking for a letter of commitment. They want to know what you in this letter, what you're committing to participate in the project. And it could be, for instance, one that we're working on now, we got an application or a letter of support from a school that's agreeing to let us come in and do some of the prevention education that we wanted to do. We've got a letter from a hospital that's agreeing to attend and send a team of participants to a training that we're proposing to do. So it's not just, yep, we support what they're doing. It's got to be something tangible that organization is committing. Also, I would get those very early on in the process. Toward the end, you want to commit to focusing on the narrative and the attachment, because that's where the points are. So you want to devote as much time as possible to those. I also encourage you not to use a template. There's been lots of times I've gotten requests to provide letters of support, and it'll be just a highlighted section, insert your organization information here. And it's obvious that they've sent this same letter template to multiple organizations. And then I just put myself in the place of those reviewers, that if I got something like that and every letter essentially was written the same way with just one section different, to me, that's the applicant saying that they took the lazy way out. So what we do, and again, it's just a little nuanced thing. I write every letter of support and send it to the folks that we want letters from and say, hey, here's a proposed letter of support. Are you willing to sign this? Sometimes I'll ask them in advance, but for the most part, I've got a good enough relationship with folks across the region that I'll just go ahead and write it, because I know what I want them to say. And once you give it to them and say, hey, here it is, you don't have to do any work other than just sign it, almost without fail, they're willing to send that back to you. I would encourage you to include a map, even if the application doesn't require one, because we always internally talk about what's this person, the reviewer that's from Nebraska, that knows nothing about Northeastern Kentucky. What can we do to make them get a picture? And I'm a visual person, so let's give them a map so they can see the counties and where it is in relation to the rest of the state and Central Appalachia. So I would encourage you to include a map, even if it's not requested. And then finally, write and rewrite and rewrite, and then edit it like you're a reviewer. We don't, as Connie mentioned, like send it out to external folks to look at. We pretty much keep it in-house, but I go back to that review criteria and score it internally within my own mind. Like, are we hitting all the required elements? And again, just where I've got a writing background, I like to think I'm pretty good with the grammar and all that sort of thing. So, but if you don't have that skill set on your team, then certainly you should pursue sending that out. So that's the information I had to share with you, and I'd be happy to take any questions, as I'm sure the other presenters would be.
Thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed hearing your sort of tips for success, really putting that in the context of the success that you've had with grant writing. It was very meaningful. So thank you for sharing all of that information. And I don't know if I'm happy or sorry that we took you out of the grant writing trenches just this morning.
Oh, that's okay. I needed a break.
Okay, okay, good. Well, thank you for sharing all of that very valuable information for our attendees today. I did not see questions in the chat, but I know that we're fairly close on time because Lisa will come back to us with some housekeeping at the end. So we have to be mindful of that related to continuing education. But are there questions that people wanted to pose to any of our presenters at this time? If you wanted to sort of just raise your hand or indicate that you had something to ask, we'd be more than happy to hear it. So there's a question in the chat for David about your organization. What organization are
Sure.
you?
So, yeah, so we're based with St. Clair Healthcare. It's the hospital healthcare system really in Moorhead. But my particular department is the Northeast Kentucky Area Health Education Center.
So, you know, one thing that occurred to me, thank you so much, David, when you were speaking about, and you had that impressive list of grants you've been successful with, you talked a little bit about, I think, planning grants or one-year planning grants, maybe as a step to some of the multi-year grants. Could you say a little bit more about that for those who may be new to grant writing? Would you sort of suggest that as a possible pathway for folks that are kind of getting their feet wet with grant writing?
Yeah, I mean, the planning grants, and that's both fall within HRSA. So there's a kind of two arms of HRSA, at least the grants we apply for. There's the community-based programming that includes a funding opportunity called Rural Health Network Development. And with that, there's a network development planning grant, and that's a 1 year, $100,000 just to pull together a group of partners who might not have ever worked together before. And you do that for a year, and then there's always a cycle behind that. That in the past has been 3 years. This time, that's what I'm working on now. Is that the next network development project? It's actually 4 years this time. But the planning process is so important, and just how internally, I like to think this is part of what I bring to the team is knowing what we've done on a previous project and how it feeds into the next project, which leads to the next project, and that's. I would encourage you very early on in your process to be thinking that way, that it's not just one grant and then we'll be done with this. It can lead to multiple years of funding. The network development, there's an organization within our region that got 1 year of planning and 3 successive network development cycles. So they had 10 years of funding. So I hope we can do that, but always. And then there's a separate arm within HRSA called the RCORP, and that's, again, should be very relevant for this audience. It's the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. And that funding mechanism has, gosh, at this point, there are 7 or 8 different types of grants under that there is a planning cycle with that. And then they have 3-year implementation awards. So it would be really difficult to go from just cold turkey to getting one of the 3-year $1 million implementation grants. You need to, I think, to give yourself the best opportunity to invest in trying to get a 1-year planning grant, or I think actually the RCORP has moved to 2-year. Their planning grants are now 2 years, and to show that investment before you try to get one of the really large projects.
That sounds like very good advice. Thank you so much, David. Ronnie or Connie, did you want to comment on that particular question? There you go.
We have not received a planning grant, but we've participated with David in several of those planning grants. So I guess my advice would be for folks, HRSA, and David chime in here, is you must have, the county must be designated rural by HRSA before they're eligible for funding. So for our region, we have 2 counties that are not designated. So we can't do anything region-wide because of that, the exclusion of those 2 counties. So that's just one thing to be aware of with HRSA, is before you even think about it, be sure to check to make sure that you're in one of the designated counties.
Yeah, and I'll just emphasize that those designations can change. So even like this new one, I didn't take it for granted that just because X county had been rural before that they still would be. I went through, our coalition serves 18 counties. And so I had to go, I went through every one of those just to make sure that they're the same status that they had been before. One of those counties, and me and Ronnie, we overlapped with Greenup County. It's a partial county. Part of it is considered rural and part of it is not. So you've got to, it's the HRSA, it's the Rural Eligibility Analyzer is the name of the tool. So you can just Google that. You can put in a whole county, or you can put in a street address and it'll pop up. Yes, this entire county is eligible for rural grants, or no, this county is not eligible for rural grants. So yeah, I mean, that's one of those front end things that Connie talked a lot about, that before you invest hours and hours and hours, and I promise you it's hours and hours and hours of working on one of these applications, make sure that you're eligible, make sure that, again, I always check how many awards are they giving. I mean, you just want to balance all of that before you decide, yes, we're in totally on this one. And I've had some folks that have said before, oh, let's just take a shot and we'll see. We don't do that. I mean, we don't have the human resource capacity to just, we'll take a chance. No, like I said, if we don't feel confident that we're going to be competitive, we just take a pass and try to find the next one that we will be competitive in.
I can't really speak to planning grants in my current position, but when I was with drug court, what I'll say about that is we started a statewide drug court program with 3-year planning grants from BJA. I want to say the first one was written in 1996. And that was the Fayette County one. And then from 1996, we started writing planning grants for other counties in the state. And by 2004, we were moving away from planning grants into implementation grants, and we were able to secure enough grant funding through those grants to go to the General Assembly and say, we've got this much in grant funding, will you match it so that we can take drug courts statewide? And then by the time I left in 2015, when I retired, we had drug courts in every county in Kentucky except for 2 jurisdictions. And so that this whole statewide drug court program started with a couple planning grants from BJA.
And off mute. Thank you so much, Connie. It's nice to hear from each of you kind of about the power of a planning grant, right? What you can really accomplish with that. So I am mindful of our time. I see Lisa is back. I just wanted to once again thank our presenters so much and make one note that Lisa put in the chat a document related to the opioid abatement funds application that I'm sure many of us are aware has been released and is out there. And then Ronnie is digging into it.
Yep.
Up on screen.
I've got mine too, Ronnie.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it personally, but I understand it might be somewhat of a beast. So do take a look at that if it's of interest to you. And I'm going to stop there and just very grateful to each of you for sharing your expertise with us. And with that, I will turn it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Hillary. I will echo those comments too. Great session, so informative, and I learned a lot. So I really do appreciate you coming here and presenting and really helping us out here. Right now, I'm going to share my screen here and tell you how to get CE credits. And I do have a link here for that opioid abatement funds. This is just the general website, and I will share that. I'm going to send a follow-up link in an email, so you'll have that link. But I also did, like Hillary said, sent the documents of the frequently asked question document that you can look at and review. We have done a grant writing session last year when we were just doing our Wave 1 county. So I will there is a link that's going in the chat box, so you can view that video too and look at some of that information. And it was more geared towards finding the funding opportunities and some of the basics of grant writing that may be helpful. For getting a certificate of complete education here today, that if you just want a certificate of attendance, go ahead and click on this link. It is being shared in the chat box, and fill that out, and you'll get a certificate. I will respond by giving you a certificate of attendance. For those of you that are licensed and need a certificate from CE Central, and those are nurses, physicians, social workers, licensed alcohol and drug counselors. You will get onto this link to CE Central, get credit, and then type in this activity code. Now, if this is the first time you're using CE Central, you do have to register, but it takes like less than a minute to register. It's simple, it's easy, and it's free. But then you go ahead and enter that code and you will get your certificate immediately. We always want your feedback. We want to hear what you liked about this session and what do you want in future sessions going forward. So this survey really takes about a minute to complete, if you wouldn't mind doing that. And again, the link is in the chat box. We really would appreciate and we really value your opinion. Just to let you know, December 7th is our next upcoming Learning Collaborative session. It's going to be harm reduction strategies within the faith-based community. We have Reverend Erica Paulette coming from, well, she's presenting, she'll be on Zoom, from New York City, and she is the director of Faith and Harm Reduction with the Harm Reduction Coalition. So she will be presenting on December 7th, and we hope to see you there. Invites will probably go out within this next week. And just a statement, you'll get this, all the PowerPoint slides and any of the links from today, you will get that in an email.